Restaurants and romance, empire and opera, fun, surprising experiences at every one of the more than 300 stops on the metro. My name is Lisa. I'm a writer and tour guide. I carry a Canadian passport, but all we'll need is a ticket for the metro system as I show you historic, inspirational, endlessly fabulous Paris. I'd like to share my love for this spectacular city with you, one stop after the next, by way of the exciting Paris metro system. So grab your French phrasebook and put on your walking shoes. We're going to Paris. Next stop, Bastille. The name Bastille conjures images of stone castle towers, imprisoned noblemen, and revolution. But there is so much more to this amazing neighborhood. Today we'll visit artisans who still occupy this once insurgent part of the city. We'll taste fabulous French food and explore the narrow alleys behind magnificent boulevards. We'll get in elbow to elbow with the people in the markets of the Bastille, and we'll go underground to kick up our heels, medieval style. Welcome to Metro Bastille, which is built on the site of the old Bastille prison destroyed during the Revolution. The metro is located right on Place de la Bastille, which is found at the intersection of the 3rd, 4th, 11th, and 12th arrondissements in this ancient city. For over 2 centuries now, Place de la Bastille has been a symbol of liberty for the people, with its gilded statue of the Spirit of Liberty standing atop the magnificent July column in the center of Bastille. The golden statue faces Rue Saint-Antoine, one of the oldest roads in Paris. In the Gallo-Roman era, this road led from the center of town all the way and beyond the old fortifications that surrounded and protected the city and dated to the 10th century. Back then, Paris only stretched out to the Baudoyer Gate. The walls and the gates are now long gone, with only the name remaining in the form of Place Baudoyer. Around the year 1200, before leaving on a crusade, the King Philippe Auguste built a new wall to protect the growing city of Paris. A new gate was built some 450 meters further from its precedent, just east of the intersection of Saint-Antoine and Rue de Sévigné. And so, until 1382, the city limits of Paris ended exactly here. And so in Bastille, under the reign of Charles V, much of the wall was torn down and new fortifications were built, enlarging the original footprint of Paris by several hundred meters. These are the actual outlines of the Bastille prison. This is where the fortifications began. To protect the city from invaders and their catapults and cavalry, and also to help maintain order in Paris, which had revolted in 1358, King Charles included fortresses along the city wall, and the Bastille was an important example. The fortress served multiple functions. First, to keep out invaders who may try to gain entry at the Saint-Antoine Gate, but also to offer protection to the nearby Hôtel Saint-Paul, a Paris vacation home used by the royal family. A further advantage to the placement of the Bastille was that it offered protection to the road outside Paris, in case the royals were forced to flee insurrection and move to their secondary home, the Château de Vincennes. The first stones of the Bastille were laid on the 22nd of April, 1370. At first, it was a true fortress and castle, with 24-meter-high walls and a deep moat that was fed by waters diverted from the Seine. Later, under Louis XI, the fortress began to be used as a prison as well as serving as a safe for valuables. It was also a reception hall under Francis I. It was Cardinal Richelieu who's credited with transforming the Bastille into a state prison, which stood as a symbol of the absolute power of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Despite its impressive size, the Bastille only ever had 42 prison cells. It never held more than 45 prisoners at any one time. These were primarily political and religious prisoners, such as seditious writers and scandalous aristocrats. Some of the most famous Bastille prisoners include Voltaire and the Marquis de Sade. Neighboring Parisians living in poverty nearby were infuriated by the lavish conditions inside the Bastille prison, which was far more comfortable than their own living quarters, so-called free outside the walls. Inmates were allowed to bring their own furniture, guests, and even servants to the Bastille prison. By 1789, revolutionary fever was building in Paris as outraged mobs destroyed a factory and the mansion of its aristocratic owner. The popular uprising began gaining momentum, and on the 14th of July, 1789, an angry mob stormed the Bastille, hoping to free prisoners and find gunpowder to arm themselves. But there were hardly any prisoners or gunpowder inside. The legendary attack on the Bastille is really the symbol for the beginning of the French Revolution. The successful storming of the Bastille meant that the prison's governor was killed and his head carried in the streets on a pike. 2 days after it was taken, the Bastille began to be dismantled stone by stone. Some of these were made into souvenir miniatures of the old prison, but the majority were used to build the beautiful Concorde Bridge. Today, though, the Bastille is known for its amazing markets, for its serious artisans drawing on centuries of craftsmanship in this neighborhood, and, of course, the famous Opera Bastille. Before the modern opera house, this space was occupied by the Gare de la Bastille train station, which was built in the middle of the 1800s. The demolition of the out-of-date train station began in 1984, and the new opera house was finally ready for inauguration on July the 13th, 1989, an important date. Behind me is the great inviting staircase of the Opera Bastille, which was built to celebrate the bicentennial of the storming of the Bastille prison. The old prison was the subject of much controversy during its time here, and the new opera house has also seen its share of difficulties swirling around its design and construction. The entire project was nearly called off by the government of Jacques Chirac. There were squabbles over artistic direction and huge budget overruns, with the final cost of the building soaring to 2.8 billion francs. Even after construction was finished, the controversy continued as pieces of the limestone facade began falling off the structure, endangering passers-by and requiring ugly safety nets. It was years before new plaques made of composite material were used to replace the troubled limestone originals. It turned out that the structure was also in need of major renovations to soundproof it from street noise. There are 2,703 seats in the huge auditorium, and every single ticket, even high up in the cheap seats, offers an uninterrupted view of the stage. Some say that the acoustics of the enormous hall are a bit disappointing compared to other grand opera houses, but I personally think it sounds amazing. Like the city that surrounds it, the Bastille Opera has survived its early difficulties, and now this modern building stages fabulous works of ballet and opera for an extremely discerning audience. I'd like to show you some more of what this part of Paris has to offer visitors today, right after this. We're in Paris, the most beautiful city on earth, but also a city with a history of revolution and change. We're exploring the area around the Bastille Metro today, named for the notorious prison. These days, the neighborhood is far less incendiary and a lot of fun. When you get out of the metro here, it's hard to miss the slender July column that stands in the middle of the busy roundabout Bastille. 3 years after the revolution was kicked off at this very spot with the storming of the Bastille. This former prison location was turned into Place de la Bastille. The square was going to include a statue representing liberty breaking free of the chains of tyranny, but no one could agree or finance the plans. By 1808, 16 years after the initial idea, there was still no statue in the square, so Napoleon decided to erect his own monument in the space. His plan called for an immense fountain in the form of an elephant, cast from the bronze of captured Spanish cannon. An 80-foot-tall, full-scale plaster model of the monstrosity was erected in 1813. It was immortalized in Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. But then Napoleon was sent into exile, and his giant plaster elephant began to fall into terrible disrepair. Parisians began to grumble. Finally, Louis-Philippe decided to complete the original 50-year-old plan, updating it to also commemorate the 1830 revolution. The column as it appears today was inaugurated in 1840. In the base of the column commemorating the 1830 revolution are buried the bones of 500 martyrs who were killed during that revolt. However, the bodies had been thrown originally into a garden near the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is where Napoleon had put 2 mummies from his Egyptian campaign. When the bodies of the martyrs from 1830 were moved, the mummies were mixed up in there and no one bothered to sort them out. So the mummies and the martyrs are now in this column. The dates on the column, the 27th, 28th, and 29th of July, 1830, are known to the French as the Trois Glorieuses, or the Glorious Three. These were the dates for the Second Revolution, which saw the removal of Charles X and his replacement with a constitutional monarch, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. Now, my favorite thing about this neighborhood is not actually the busy Place de la Bastille, but it's all of the passageways that this neighborhood is famous for, because this used to be the great quartier of the craftsmen and the artisans who designed all of the gilt and furniture that Louis XIV used in Versailles. The Place de la Bastille is ringed with grand buildings occupied by tenants whose French windows give out onto iconic views of the July column. The places I'd like to show you now are tucked just between and behind these grand facades. Right off Place de la Bastille, in fact, almost facing the opera, is one of my favorite of the passageways in this neighborhood, the Cour d'Amois. Very old, romantic feeling, and there is even a small coffee roaster right at the end of the passageway. These charming passageways and interconnecting courtyards lead from one busy avenue to another. But here, just steps from the noisy roundabout Bastille, you'll find yourself in another atmosphere altogether. Keep your eyes open for the entryways off the main avenues, and then venture in for a look around and a step into Old Paris. This is the Passage de la Boule Blanche. It's right off the busy street of Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which is full of all kinds of chain shops right near Bastille. Not that attractive, but as soon as you step off the busy street, you're in these narrow passageways that are calm and filled with small businesses, even today. You'll find restaurants, art galleries, fashion boutiques, all sorts of interesting shops and businesses tucked into these quaint little passageways, barely wide enough for a car. The passageways have charming names like the Three Brothers or the Boule Blanche, which means the white ball in the sculpture here. Centuries ago, when these alleys were coming into being, the names on the entryways were often accompanied by statues and metal signs. so that customers of the day, many of whom could not read, could find their way to the right address in the maze of shops and alleys that spreads out beyond the Place de la Bastille. We can step in here at the Passage du Chantier. For hundreds of years, people have been building and repairing furniture in this very alleyway. In fact, what used to happen is the artisans would work and glue and saw all of the furniture on the main floor here, and their families would live upstairs. So walking down the street, you had all the sounds of the families and the smells of cooking, and you had the sawdust flying into the street. It was a very lively, crowded kind of atmosphere. It's an absolute must-see. French furniture makers have set the standard for centuries and encompass a wide range of styles and tastes. From the ornate excess of royal furniture designed for king and court, to the more utilitarian and practical provincial styles favored by working class people, the furniture styles developed and perfected in France, and in Paris in particular, have spread worldwide. The many skilled craftspeople still at work in these passageways are continuing to provide gorgeous, one-of-a-kind pieces, as well as restoring and rejuvenating adored old antiques and heirlooms. Many of the ateliers are open to the public, so even if you're not looking for a perfect, high-backed Louis XIV chair today, you can feel welcome to come and admire the amazing work being done in these charming passageways in this part of Paris. And there's lots more that I want to show you in this wonderfully creative neighborhood right after this. We're in the ever-evolving, ever-creating city of Paris, and we're exploring the area around the Bastille metro station in what has become a very creative part of the French capital. For many years, this area was dominated by the Bastille railway station, which stood where the Opéra Bastille now does, facing the July column. This station was served by the Vincennes Railway, and although the trains don't come through here anymore, they left a substantial influence. A long section of elevated viaduct remains behind the opera and has found a new life more than a century after its original construction. The Viaduc des Arts was renovated in the 1990s, turning what had been empty arched spaces into a series of wonderful atelier and workshop studio spaces for craftsmen and artists of all specialities. It's a wonderful place to walk along and admire different styles of art and work. You could easily spend a whole day looking in on the many ateliers that have set up under the old railway tracks. That could be a whole other TV show, but let me just quickly show you a couple of my favorite stops. L'Atelier du Temps Passé is a restoration atelier run by Annette Doué. She's been here for 13 years, and she's one of the most respected art restorers in the city of Paris. Today they're having an open house, so the public is encouraged to go in and check out what they're up to. Let's go see. Repurposed spaces under the old viaduct are amazingly spacious and bright, not at all the Hobbit house you might have imagined. Annette's restoration studio has a lovely atmosphere with high arched ceilings, allowing for lots of windows to work in bright light. Annette took the time to show me around her restoration business, explaining how she brings delicate old works of art back to their original beauty. Using a sample painting that a client found rolled in an attic, Annette shows me that even centuries-old, heavily damaged canvases can be literally turning to dust and then saved by using a series of careful techniques. And the first thing Annette does with it is she puts it on a new linen canvas so it can be properly stretched, because of course it's been rolled up and the original canvas is so damaged at this point. Once the work has been remounted, it's cleaned of any contaminants and pollution that have adhered to the surface over time. It's at this point that old varnish is painstakingly removed from the pigment layer. Old varnishes yellow over time and gradually conceal the impact of the piece's original colors. The process continues with a new layer of restoration quality varnish applied over the existing pigments, which revives the colors. Then a product called mastic is applied. Essentially, this is like plastering cracks in your walls before painting over them. The mastic fills in and levels any voids on the painting's surface and gives the restorers something to work on as they paint in the pieces that are missing or damaged. And also, Annette's making the point that everything they do to restore a painting is reversible. They do nothing that is going to stay there forever. That's part of the principle of restoration, that you do nothing that can't be improved upon or restored later on. You're not changing the original here. So once the work is on a stable backing, has been cleaned, and the mastic has been applied to fill in any voids, the final stage of the restoration is to cover the repaired areas with a pigmented restoration varnish, so the repairs blend in and disappear, allowing the original image to make its intended impression. It's really interesting considering the state of restoration today. In order to work in this field, you need to not only work on restoring the painting, but you have to know a lot about art, you have to do the research, you also have to know a lot about science. In the downstairs spaces, Annette has ultraviolet machines, she's got all kinds of scientific equipment to make these paintings look the way they should. You can actually study to get a diploma in art restoration here in Annette's studio. It takes 3 years. This kind of work was typically necessary once a century to maintain old works of art. But Annette explains that nowadays, with cheaper quality paints and a more polluted atmosphere, partly because of the hole in the ozone layer, paintings today need this kind of attention every 40 to 50 years. Let's march a little further down the old railway tracks to the next place I'd like to show you. While still in the creative vein, the work done here is of a more musical nature. Here we are in the beautiful Songja flutes in the wonderfully acoustic arched space in the Viaduc des Arts. Now, Sophie Songja here repairs flutes, which is a very rare profession these days, and she also sells flutes. People come from all over the world to check out the flutes here, along with the concerts and other events. Sophie Songja actually walked into this flute shop about 15 years ago when the artisans were just installing their spaces in the Viaduc des Arts. She had studied jewelry making nearby and is not musical, does not have a music background at all. However, Sophie fell in love with the flutes, and when you watch her working on these musical instruments, you can understand how jewelry making really does feed into the precision you need to repair flutes. Silver flutes are extremely delicate, they're very difficult to calibrate, and this shop, this atelier, has become world-renowned for its expertise. Sophie also organizes workshops and special seminars about the flute. She sells music here and, of course, wonderful flutes. Along with the many creative businesses that have set up shop under the old train's viaduct, the city of Paris has refurbished and repurposed the top of the old structure as well. The trains used to take people out of the city to the Bois de Vincennes, about 3 miles east of the former Bastille station. The trains are long gone, but you can still walk along the narrow linear park that follows the old footprint of the railway. It's called the Promenade Plantée. Beyond the viaduct, the promenade returns to ground level, intersects with other parks, and even soars over traffic as it links modern buildings to the paths left by the old railway lines. Now I've got a great suggestion for a place to stop and eat around the Bastille right after this. We're in Paris, a city known as much for its revolutions as its romances. And we're exploring the romantic heart of a district known for the revolution that kicked off right here. The area around the Bastille metro station. Let's stop and have a bite to eat before we continue with our look around the neighborhood. I started coming to Café de l'Industrie about 15 years ago when I was living nearby in the Marais. I would walk over here to the Bastille, pick up a coffee, maybe meet some friends, artists who lived in the neighborhood, have a drink. And over time, Café de l'Industrie has actually spread across the street, and now there are 3 different locations, all within a stone's throw of each other. The small red and blue signs above the facades let you know that these are in fact all the same business, not some bizarre battle of the cafes with competition all vying for the same name. For most of the 20th century, this neighborhood was very working class. By the 1980s, artists started taking up residence, and since artists are the shock troops of gentrification, by the millennium, this area around Bastille had become very trendy. Some of the original inhabitants complain that the neighborhood has lost its soul. But in this cafe, you can eat and drink at any time of the day, grab a coffee, or dine on something traditional like shrimp or duck confit. The waitstaff in the cafe tends to be local out-of-work actors who usually have a story or two to tell. And the slightly hip and boisterous atmosphere might not lend itself to a quiet romantic soiree, but the food and the company is always good, and it's a good price. Now that we've had a good lunch, let's explore one of the fascinating avenues here in the area of Bastille Metro, a busy street with a storied history. That's the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine is actually named for the Abbey of Saint-Antoine, which used to be just outside the city limits. And the abbess, in control of this neighborhood, actually protected the artisans against the guilds and the taxes within the city. So it was really great to set up shop here, just upriver of Paris, where you could feel freer to practice your craft. Gradually, this area became more and more crowded until the population was so frustrated, this became the hotbed for the revolution in 1789. As we saw earlier, visiting the alleyways that branch off the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, many of the craftspeople who opened their businesses here originally made furniture. But today, you'll also find a fairly broad range of international chain stores on the main Faubourg Street. If you look closely, you'll find a few still functioning pieces of Paris history on the Faubourg as well. This fountain on the Faubourg Saint-Antoine was essential to the artisans who worked in this neighborhood, because of course they did not have running water, the early 1700s, but they still need water for their businesses, their cabinetry, so they would come here, stock up on what they needed, and also catch up on the latest gossip. So it's basically a water cooler from the 1700s. This fountain is called the Fontaine de Charonne because it's at the corner of Rue de Charonne, but it's locally called the Fontaine Trogneux after the tavern owner who sold beer right around the corner. This is one of 5 water fountains built to serve the neighborhood by Louis XV. Its bronze lion's heads dispense the water, and it's decorated with several aquatically themed fantastical sculptures. The fountain was restored under the First Empire and again in 1963. Let's cross Rue de Charonne and continue along Faubourg Saint-Antoine and take a right at the park. Just a little down the block, there's a simply gorgeous pastry shop I'd like to show you at number 7 Rue Antoine Vallon. This is called the blé sucré.
They do delicious bread, but really they're especially famous for the pastries. And I come here for the lemon tart, which is one of my favorites. And on warm days, you can take your tart and go sit outside in the park or sit on one of the little tables they have here. It's marvelous.
Mr. Le Bourdas, who opened this shop 7 years ago, used to bake for the super high-end palace hotels of France. No surprise then that the pastries and bread baked here are so fantastic, on par with anything you'd be served in the finest hotels, but without the pricey room fee.
I love the names of these pastries. This is épices and love, spices and love, the cocoa mango. Further on, we have le trousseau, like a bride's trousseau. We have le rayon de soleil for, gray days in Paris when you need just a little pick-me-up. The baba au rhum, a classic. A tarte tatin, which is a classic, but he does it a little bit differently to make it look like an apple.
The bakery also makes dozens of fresh sandwiches and quiche every day for local folk to pop in and grab for their lunch hour. These make a wonderful portable meal, and they're a great price for tourists on the move.
Now, the main thing with this particular pastry shop is you should never arrive at the end of the day because there will be nothing left. Every morning, Monsieur Le Bourdas makes fresh versions of all of the pastries and breads you see here. Unlike some bakeries and pastry shops where at the end of the day there is still a full cabinet of croissants and everything, and they recycle them the next day. So sometimes you get a stale croissant aux amandes, which I do not like. Here, however, everything is made fresh early in the morning and it's baked throughout the day, and you know you're going to have a fantastic almond roll that's been made this very day, freshly rolled with almond paste and sprinkled with nuts.
Though all the treats in the blé sucré are tempting, I'm going to stick with my one perfect lemon tart. And I'm going to take it to go so I can step across the street and show you a nice spot for an impromptu picnic. This is the square Trousseau, a lovely oasis just off the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. A number of identical squares like this were built across Paris in the early 20th century with lovely Belle Époque, apartment blocks, and playgrounds for children. They make a great place to enjoy a pastry. The square is very popular with kids today in a city with relatively few green spaces. And this site has been associated with the children of Paris since well before the park. In fact, in 1674, a home for orphans was built on this site. After 200 years, it was transformed into a children's hospital. The antiquated building was finally removed in 1902, making way for this lovely English garden-style park, which opened in 1906. It's named for the French physician Armand Trousseau, the first doctor in France to perform a tracheotomy. Let's continue our walk east along Faubourg Saint-Antoine. There's a charming little market I'd like to show you, though it's not what you might think. You'll see what I mean right after this. We're checking out the many wonderful things to see and do around the Bastille metro station, not the least of which are the amazing markets found here. Now, most markets will have fresh produce on offer, but the one I'd like to show you first also has an amazing variety of vintage, used, and estate objects for sale. The outdoor marché à Ligre is all kinds of flea market stands, the only one in the center of Paris, and people have been selling inexpensive treasures here for hundreds of years. So it's worth taking a look, see what you can find. Flea markets may not be the first thing you picture when you think of the typical Parisian market. But the Marché d'Aligre is not your typical kind of market. Since the 1700s, when the abbess of the area gave the poor her permission to sell used goods here, there have been merchants selling everything from rare antiques to straight-out junk. These days, under the gaze of the modern apartment block, one of the market's biggest personalities is just over here selling West African art.
This is Mr. Gregoire's stand. It specializes in African art. And actually, the man who runs this stand is a French rocker from the 60s and 70s, Musique. He actually sang at the Olympia, which is the pinnacle of French rock stardom, not once, but 6 times. So he's a great character for this area and really fun.
Moustique also ran a restaurant in Paris for some time, but now he spends his days dealing in the art he loves.
Now, the reason an old French rocker collects African art is because he performed in Congo. While he was there, he fell in love with a whole bunch of sculptures, brought them back to France, and started selling them in this stand in Aligre. So if you like West African art, check out this stand.
Bastille also has a more traditional food market I'd like to show you. Let's head back onto Faubourg Saint-Antoine and follow the street back to the July column at the Bastille Metro. From the traffic circle, we'll head north onto the gorgeous boulevard Richard Lenoir.
In the shadow of the Bastille is a wonderful food market on Sunday and Thursdays, the Richard Lenoir Market on Boulevard Richard Lenoir. It's a great place to pick up all the ingredients you need for a wonderful French meal. Oh wow, lobsters from Brittany. Actually cooked crabs, which saves you the trouble of having to cook them. Oh, these are crazy. These are huge oysters called pied de cheval, horse hoof oysters, because of the size and shape. Bonjour, ça va? Oh, super bien, j'adore le marché.
C'est bien. Merci, hein.
Oui, j'espère passer beaucoup de temps là-bas. Hein?
Well, Parisians have a reputation for being, shall we say, a little cold towards visitors. I find that if you take the time to say bonjour here and show interest in the food being sold, the people will usually appreciate your efforts and warm up. The people working in the many stands of the Richard Lenoir market are more than happy to tell you where their wares come from and explain how to cook or prepare the ingredients.
Every neighborhood in Paris has a temporary market like this that opens a couple of mornings per week. But the Richard Lenoir market is especially well known for the quality of its produce and the variety of stands. You can get everything here, from clothes to food to fresh oysters. You can even get your antique chair repaired. This one, definitely, I like the color.
The market takes over a few blocks of the boulevard as it stretches away from the July column, and the cross streets are still open even when the market is in place. So keep an eye out for passing trucks and scooters as you stroll between the stands. Even though the merchants have to set up and take down their stands twice a week, this temporary food market is really very well put together. Year-round, you'll find fresh vegetables and fruit. There are prepared foods like crepes and roasted chickens and delicious Creole dumplings. You'll find that the vendors all have refrigerated cases for their perishable products. So it's like going to the world's best grocery store, only without the store.
You got fresh chicken. This is cool, actually. Because in France, there's different kinds of chickens, and to show and prove that they're the specialty chickens, they leave the feet on. For example, the poulet de Bresse is famous for its black feet, so they leave the feet on. Normandy chickens have yellow feet. That's how you identify them. You know which kind of dish you should do with the chickens.
Whether you have a shopping list or not, a stroll around the Marché Richard Lenoir is a fantastic way to start the day in the Bastille area of Paris. And next, I'd like to show you a couple of wonderful ways to wrap up the day, right after this. We're in beautiful Paris. We've been exploring the area around the Bastille metro station today, and I've saved a couple of delightful spots for us to visit to wrap up our day. Just across from the Aligre market that we visited earlier is a fantastic little wine bar called the Baron Rouge, or the Red Baron, that famous German fighter pilot. After the market closes, you often find market stand owners enjoying a glass at the end of their workday here.
Je pensais peut-être un Bourgogne rouge.
D'accord, j'ai un très bon givry qui est très agréable, très élégant.
On va faire
Je vous donne
ça.
ça.
Olivier is the owner of this very hip, no-frills Baron Rouge, and I always take his advice when it comes to wine.
Voilà. À
Merci
votre santé.
So I have a lovely givry, which is from Burgundy. Santé to Olivier, who says that it should be just what I want this evening. I have a little sip. Oh, that's lovely.
The givry that Olivier recommended is just one of a well-chosen selection of wines that he keeps in stock. And don't worry if you're not a big connoisseur of the grape. The atmosphere at the Baron Rouge is casual and friendly, not at all intimidating or stuffy. It's a really special spot, a great local place.
There is another reason the Baron Rouge is special. Come see. You see, this is what's special about the Baron Rouge, is you can actually, if you live in the neighborhood, bring empty bottles here and have them refilled with the wine of your choice really inexpensively. So you can have your own vin de table, table wine, chez toi. Now, if you're having a bigger party, you can also buy the plastic gallon shapes and fill those with wine, again, cheap. And Olivier will give you a little tap so you can serve everybody you've invited with wine from the Baron Rouge.
If you know a little French, you'll recognize the word cave on the awning at Baron Rouge. It's short for cave à vin, or wine cellar. Now I'd like to take you to another kind of cellar, but for this trip we'll have to go back in time, or at least imagine.
Here we are at Les Caves, just off Bastille, where you have to dress up to get into the basement cave dance bar nightclub of Les Caves. Now, for the medieval, pirate, barbarian look, admittedly, you don't always have the costume in your suitcase, so fortunately, Les Caves will provide you with a costume. Bonsoir, en fait, j'ai besoin de quelque chose. It's going to be perfect. Merci beaucoup. Ça, c'est la ceinture. OK, merci bien.
Twice a month, Les Caves holds this special costume night. And here in these actual historic Parisian cellars and catacombs, the effect is really impressive. It's easy to let yourself fall into character and imagine centuries gone by. Medieval suits of armor, swords, and candles decorate the ancient stone vaulted walls and ceiling and complete the atmosphere.
Les Caves is actually an authentic series of basements that date several centuries back. These are original caves that they've reconnected into this wonderful basement nightclub. And what's great about Les Caves is it's really welcoming. Half the people here come to these special events once a month. They dress up, they have a real community here, but they're delighted when new people arrive. There are tables of people playing cards, dancing old-style medieval dancing, and wonderful, wonderful, old-fashioned musicians.
When Les Caves isn't holding one of its special medieval costume nights, it remains a popular place among night owls in Paris. There's a thumping modern sound system to take over from the musicians. The goth element of Paris comes to dance into the wee hours in this somewhat spooky club. As for me, I had a wonderful night, even though I didn't know any of the medieval dance steps when I arrived.
Well, that was a great day in Bastille, especially learning about all the craftsmanship that is so important to the neighborhood, the artisans who still live and work here. And what could be more appropriate than finishing up in the place of the Bastille prison to go to a medieval night in the cave over here. Let's see what we can get up to next time at Paris Next Stop.